The stage lights glared down on Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro, two of the most iconic figures in Hollywood, seated face to face on a live talk show. The crowd's excitement was palpable. This was a clash of titans, two legendary actors, both known for their strength, charisma, and larger-than-life personas. The air buzzed with anticipation. The host, a sharp-witted late-night television personality, kicked things off with his usual banter. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have two legends, Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro, on the same stage. The tough guy from the West versus the king of gritty New York roles, a show you won't forget." The crowd erupted into applause. Clint gave a quick nod, his face as stoic as ever. De Niro smirked, leaning slightly back in his chair, clearly confident. They had both played tough, unforgettable roles, but something was different tonight. Something in the air felt off. It began innocuously enough, a typical evening of friendly back and forth. The host cracked a joke about their famous films, Clint's Dirty Harry and De Niro's Taxi Driver, but then the host made a comment that caught Clint off guard. "Clint, everyone knows you're a man of few words, but Robert here, he's a bit more vocal. Tell us, Clint, how do you feel about someone who's always talking and never shutting up?" The crowd chuckled. Robert De Niro laughed too, leaning in, fully expecting Clint to laugh along. But Clint's eyes narrowed. The tone in the room shifted. The audience held their breath, sensing something was about to break. Clint didn't respond with a quip or a smile. Instead, he leaned forward slowly, his piercing gaze fixed on De Niro. Some men talk to fill the silence. Others talk because they have nothing to say. The host chuckled nervously, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But De Niro's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew wider. "You always talk about silence, Clint," Robert said, his voice carrying an edge. "But sometimes silence means you're just avoiding things that need to be said." The crowd's laughter faltered, unsure of whether this was part of the act or if the tension between the two legends was real. Clint's jaw clenched slightly, his face tightening as if he had just been struck. De Niro's words stung more than Clint wanted to admit. His calm exterior had been shattered. The quiet man from the West was now facing an insult he wasn't ready to let slide. Clint Eastwood was no stranger to being tested. His entire career had been built on the back of his unyielding resolve, a man who never backed down from a challenge. But the jab from Robert De Niro, that hit harder than he expected. The studio lights above them seemed to intensify, casting long shadows on Clint's chiseled face. The audience, sensing a shift, quieted down, waiting for Clint's response. De Niro sat back in his chair, his smug expression barely masking the provocation he had just delivered. Clint didn't react immediately, and that in itself was unsettling. He was a man of few words, yes, but everyone in that room knew that Clint's silences were often more dangerous than words could ever be. His silence was a weapon honed through years of playing tough, decisive characters in films like Unforgiven and the Outlaw Josie Wales. But tonight, in the studio, it felt different. Clint took a long, deliberate breath, his lips barely twitching. The host, trying to salvage the situation, cleared his throat. "Well, Clint, it's clear you're a man of action, not words. But let's move on to something lighter." But Clint wasn't listening. His mind was locked in. His pulse was steady. He could feel the pressure mounting. De Niro's words lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. "Silence means you're avoiding things." A chill ran through Clint's veins. He wasn't just sitting in a studio. He was standing at the edge of a precipice. The world could see him, but he wasn't about to show weakness. No, Clint Eastwood wasn't someone who allowed insults to fly without consequence. Finally, after a long, pregnant pause, Clint spoke. His voice was low, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "You think I'm avoiding something, Bobby?" he asked, turning his head slowly toward De Niro, his eyes like steel. The room held its breath. De Niro raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Well, you've been avoiding the real question for years, Clint. You and I both know it." Clint's jaw tightened. He was done playing games. The time for witty exchanges was over. He wasn't about to let De Niro's arrogant remark slide. He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto De Niro's. "Let's get something straight," Clint said, his voice barely above a whisper, but dripping with menace. "You don't get to make me the butt of your jokes, and you sure as hell don't get to question my silence. I've said more with a glance than most people say in a lifetime." De Niro's confident demeanor faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I didn't mean any offense, Clint," he said, though the smirk was still firmly in place. Clint's face remained unreadable. He wasn't here to play the role of the villain in De Niro's story. He had no time for that. "I didn't think you did," Clint replied, his voice now colder, sharper. "But you've got a lot of things twisted, Bobby. You think words are what make a man. I think it's actions that define him. You'll figure that out someday." The tension in the room was now palpable. It wasn't just a verbal exchange anymore. It had escalated into something deeper. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some unsure of how to react. What they were witnessing wasn't a playful spat. It was a standoff between two titans, and Clint Eastwood had just thrown the gauntlet down. The air in the studio was thick with unspoken words, tension hanging like a storm about to break. Clint Eastwood, ever the master of restraint, had allowed the situation to build. Now, the silence in the room was deafening. The crowd waited for the next move, and Clint knew exactly what he was about to do. De Niro, clearly trying to regain control, chuckled lightly, as if trying to laugh off Clint's cutting words. "You know, Clint, I didn't come here to start a war," he said with a slight grin, hoping to diffuse the heat. "I was just trying to have a little fun." But Clint wasn't buying it anymore. He wasn't about to let De Niro's charm or quick wit deflect from the fact that he had been publicly insulted. And the more De Niro tried to downplay it, the angrier Clint became. Clint stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving De Niro. It was a movement filled with purpose, a man not just standing up from his chair, but a man stepping into the arena. "You think this is fun?" Clint's voice rang out across the studio, the calmness of it betraying the storm underneath. "You think you can just jab at me and expect me to sit here like a joke?" De Niro looked up, realizing too late that he had pushed Clint too far. There was a visible shift in his posture, the smugness beginning to fade as Clint's icy stare bore into him. "I don't know what you think this is, but it's not a game," Clint continued, his voice steady but heavy with an undeniable weight. "Words may amuse some people, but I don't get my kicks from talking. I get them from showing the world what I'm made of." The host, sensing the escalation, quickly stepped in, trying to break up the mounting tension. "Gentlemen, please, we're live on TV. Let's keep things civil." But Clint didn't look away from De Niro. "Let him laugh all he wants," Clint said, his voice cutting through the host's plea. "But there's a difference between laughing and disrespecting someone." The crowd was dead silent now. The tension in the room was unbearable. De Niro had pushed Clint past his breaking point, and now there was no going back. Clint stepped closer to De Niro, his presence commanding the space between them. "I don't know what you think you know about me, Bobby," Clint said, his voice growing colder by the second, "but you don't know a damn thing." De Niro, for the first time since the exchange began, looked a little less sure of himself. The crowd could feel it. Clint's raw power, his fury that was barely held in check. And it was clear that De Niro, for all his bravado, had underestimated the old cowboy. De Niro, the king of controlled rage, finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. Clint Eastwood wasn't just upset. He was teetering on the edge of something far more intense. De Niro's calm facade cracked just for a moment, and in that moment, Clint took full control. Clint's next words came as a shock, so cold and sharp they could cut through the tension that had been choking the room. His voice, though soft, was laced with a raw, undeniable force. "You've been living in your little world, Bobby," Clint said, his voice chilling as he leaned forward, "where everyone thinks you're the tough guy. But you're nothing more than a loudmouth who hides behind his jokes." The crowd remained silent, hanging on every word, as if they were waiting for the moment when Clint would snap and show exactly why he had earned his reputation. De Niro, once the alpha in this dynamic, looked shaken, his cocky attitude slipping away, replaced by the realization that Clint wasn't just playing a part here. This wasn't a scene from a movie. This was real. "You think you can throw jabs at me and I'll just take it? You think this is some game where you get to be the star and I'm just the supporting role?" Clint's words were like daggers, and they hit their mark. De Niro sat still, his lips pressed together, the smile now gone from his face. He had pushed Clint too far, and now the old cowboy was about to make sure he paid for it. Clint slowly straightened up, his piercing gaze locked on De Niro's eyes. "Here's the difference between you and me, Bobby. You've got a reputation to protect. I don't. I've seen things, done things, that most people could only dream of, and I don't need to talk about them to make myself feel important." Clint took a step back, almost as if releasing the pressure that had been building for so long. The crowd could feel the shift, the moment when Clint stopped playing by the rules. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was making a statement that no one, not even Robert De Niro, would forget. Clint took another breath, and then, in a calm but menacing tone, added, "So, I'll tell you this, Bobby. You can either sit there and keep pretending like you're the toughest guy in the room, or you can admit that some of us were born to walk through fire and still come out standing. You've had your fun. Now it's my turn." The host, sensing the imminent danger, quickly attempted to redirect the conversation, but Clint's icy stare was unwavering. De Niro, unable to find the right words to respond, just sat there, his face flushed, realizing the weight of the situation he had created. The tide had turned, and now Clint Eastwood was in control. The crowd was on the edge of their seats, unsure if this was about to end in a war of words or a shocking revelation. The air in the studio was electric. The usual playful banter had vanished, replaced by an intense, almost unbearable silence. Clint Eastwood, ever the embodiment of quiet intensity, had not only taken the spotlight back, but he had also shown Robert De Niro exactly who was in control. De Niro, once the dominant force in their interaction, was now visibly rattled. His sharp wit, which had so effortlessly parried through conversations and debates for years, had no place here. Clint was no longer participating in this sparring match. He had turned it into something entirely different. Clint stood tall, the weight of his words sinking into the audience. He wasn't just a man who had faced countless villains on screen. He had lived through real battles, both personal and professional. And now, in this moment, Clint Eastwood was showing De Niro and the audience just how far he would go to defend his honor. The crowd was still waiting for a response, for De Niro to fight back or try to regain some sense of control. But the silence that followed Clint's powerful statement was deafening. De Niro, looking like he had swallowed something sour, opened his mouth as if to speak, but then hesitated. What could he possibly say to defend himself against Clint Eastwood's raw, unfiltered truth? Clint's expression was unreadable, his face as stone-cold as ever. Yet there was an unmistakable glint in his eyes, a recognition that he had won this battle. But he wasn't done. Clint wasn't someone who relished in a fight unless it had meaning. He wasn't here for cheap victories. He was here to make sure the world knew just what kind of man he was. He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping over them, and then he spoke, his voice commanding attention. "This," Clint said, his voice steady and unwavering, "isn't about who can talk the loudest. It's about who can stand the test of time, who can prove day in and day out that they have what it takes to hold their ground." His words hung in the air, powerful and final. He wasn't just speaking to De Niro anymore. He was speaking to everyone in the room and to everyone watching at home. Clint had solidified his position, not through insults or bravado, but through sheer presence. De Niro, recognizing that Clint wasn't going to let him off the hook, finally sat back in his chair, the fight draining out of him. The smirk was gone. The playful arrogance had evaporated. And for the first time, Robert De Niro was looking at Clint Eastwood not as an adversary, but as a force of nature. The host, no longer able to ignore the palpable tension, finally broke the silence. "Well, it's clear we've got some real legends in the room tonight. Gentlemen, we may have to call this one a draw." But Clint wasn't finished yet. He glanced at the host with a wry smile, his voice cutting through the air. "It's not about winning a game, pal," he said. "It's about staying true to yourself, no matter who's throwing punches." As the cameras cut to a commercial break, the audience was left in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Clint Eastwood had done what no one expected. He had humiliated Robert De Niro with nothing but his presence and his truth. And in doing so, he had proven once again that Clint Eastwood didn't need to say much to leave a lasting impression. His actions spoke louder than anything else ever could.